In the early days of mirrorless cameras, the first lens mount to enter the game wasn't the E mount or the X mount, it was this, the Micro Four Thirds mount. And this was the first camera of its kind, the first Micro Four Thirds mount camera, and the first interchangeable lens mirrorless camera ever released. Except this one's broken. So, meet this. Its little brother, which is unsurprisingly even better. In 2008, the Lumix G1 hit the market. It was the first mirrorless camera and it delivered the Micro Four Thirds system to the world. While its sensor was smaller than the DSLR competition, it still had some advantages. Released 1 year before the more video-focused GH1, the G1 was purely a photography camera, even though it featured the flip LCD, which we started to attribute more to video cameras.
Big on features, small in size. The award-winning Lumix G1.
Move aside and make way for the second generation, the Lumix G2. This camera made minor but significant improvements to the ergonomics and the interface, and the ability to record video. But let's not get into the video here. You might think that both of these cameras look fairly amateur, and yes, I would probably agree with you. Even looking back at the original commercial for the G1, it's quite clear it wasn't a super serious camera. It was doing something new, but it clearly was not immediately trying to compete with the professional bodies. By the time the G2 was coming out, the commercial for the G2 was definitely more serious and more action-packed. With the smaller sensor size and the smaller lenses, the G2 and other Micro Four Thirds mount cameras deliver pro features in surprisingly small and lightweight bodies. But what does this camera still do well today when you consider how cheap you can buy it on the used market versus other options? When comparing both of these cameras in terms of like the physical ergonomics, I think the G2 overall is a major improvement. It's slightly bigger in terms of the grip, and also the material, the texture of the camera is much nicer to hold on to. And then it has made some small improvements over the G1. Instead of having the front dial, which then clicks in to change between shutter and aperture, they've actually placed this on the back, which I actually think makes much more sense with the size and style of grip that we have. And then on top of the camera, beside the mode dial, we still have the drive selector switch, which has led to me accidentally going into self-timer mode when I'm turning the camera on and off. So I've missed a few photos, but you know what? My mistake. And then on the top left of the camera, we actually have two different dials that affect our autofocus. So we have one selector switch for our manual focus, autofocus continuous or autofocus single, and then we have our different focus area dial, which I think actually works really nicely as some physical dials to have on top of the camera. You can still find all of these different settings inside the quick menu, but I guess having them up here as well does mean you can glance down and check you're in the mode you need to be in before you go to take a photo. Shooting with the G2 has genuinely been a joy, and I'm sure that if the G1 was still working, this would have been a joy as well. When shooting street photography with the G2, I forgot almost instantly about the age and the minor limitations of this camera. Speaking of limitations, we should talk about resolution here. The sensor is only 12 megapixels, and that is when you are shooting in the full 4:3 aspect ratio of the 4/3 sensor. If you were to change your aspect ratio to 3:2, which is that of a full frame sensor, you then actually lose a bit of resolution and you only get a 10.5 megapixel image. Of course, you can change between these aspect ratios and various other settings in the menu and the quick menu. So you can change for cropping, say like I do, I go into 16:9 if I need to use it for shooting some thumbnails. Now 12 megapixels might sound quite low, but really it's not. The Sony a7S III, I've talked about this so many times, only has 12 megapixels. The original 5D full frame pro camera, only 12 megapixels. And the Nikon D200 crop sensor camera that I tested earlier this year was only like 10 megapixels. The golden rule that I've come across with these cameras is that having a fun to use camera can always make up for lackluster specs, much more than having a camera with great specs that's really difficult to use. Always go for the fun camera over the high spec camera. The one place that we see image quality really make a difference here is the video image quality. Take this talking head you're looking at right now, for example. We take for granted that consumer cameras now look amazing out of the box. Now compare this to the video from the G2 from 14 years ago. It's a completely different game. But when we compare images from this G2 camera with the same camera that I'm shooting this video on right now, the images look pretty much the same. Yes, there is a difference in resolution, but most of the improvements to photography come from stabilization, they come from dynamic range, and they come from autofocus. The lens that I have here on the G2 is the standard kit zoom that came with the lens. You might recognize it from that amazing commercial. This lens is the Lumix 14 to 42mm f3.5 to 5.6, and this gives a full frame field of view of 28mm to 84mm, and it does have the optical image stabilization with the Mega OIS. And yes, when choosing a lens to shoot street photography with, I could have chosen a prime of some sort. Micro Four Thirds has countless affordable small primes. But no, I wanted to go for the original kit, and just feel like if I bought this camera new in 2010 and I was to go out and shoot street photography, how would that feel? And for me personally, 3.5 to 5.6 in terms of aperture is okay for daytime street photography. I'm rarely looking for a shallow depth of field. I was surprised to find this function as a dedicated button on the D-pad to change to film modes on the G2. Within the film modes, we can choose preset styles and make our own adjustments to these. And you also have two different My Film slots to create your own saved looks, as well as a multi-film where you can actually layer 3 different looks to create a final image. Of course, these settings only apply to the JPEG files. Whereas if you want to achieve filmic looks on your RAW files, you should try out one of my preset packs. I have 3 different preset packs: Kodak presets, Fujifilm presets, and naturally filmic presets. You can buy all 3 of these packs together in the 3-pack bundle, and the first 20 people to use this code will get 20% off my entire store. These are some of the best film simulation presets you can buy, and these are the presets I use on 100% of the images that I share online, that you see in my videos, on my Instagram, and on my website portfolio. So I'll drop a link to my presets in the description below this video. While we have an EVF on the G2, it's a very early EVF, and just for reference, it is 1/4 of the resolution of the EVF from the Lumix GX80, so you can't really expect too much, but it is there. The LCD, however, on this camera is very impressive. It is bright and it has a very responsive touchscreen that, as you can see from all the POV footage in this video, I have been using a lot for my street photography. This reason enough puts this camera ahead of many of the competing DSLRs at the time, and also some of the mirrorless competitors that were coming out around the same time. Lumix definitely got on the touchscreen interface much earlier than other brands. If you've made it this far in the video, I know I don't need to convince you about sensor size. You know as well as I do that full frame is nice to have in some situations, but really not necessary for the majority of people, especially when you're shooting during the day. For me though, when it comes to having a small camera that's fun to use, yes, there are a few small full frame cameras out there, but they are few and far between. But when you start to play with the smaller crop sensors, the smaller 1/3 size sensors, something like this G2, these cameras are just so much fun to play with. They're so much fun to shoot with. I found myself smiling a lot when I was using it, pleasantly surprised half the time, and also just letting ideas flow and not stressing about the photos I was taking, not putting too much pressure. For me, that's a problem I have, and if you have that issue as well, that's why you should be considering Micro Four Thirds cameras. If this camera seems like it's not enough resolution for you, or that you need much more from a camera compared to what you can get from this cheap G2, then I highly recommend you check out this video here on why you do not need a high resolution camera. It'll change your life.